Roman legionary. The figure we imagine is a pillar of unbending discipline, polished armor, and flawless formation. A soldier who claims to carry civilization on the point of his blade. But set aside that curated image and look at his hands. Which tools truly forged the greatest empire of the ancient world? Were they merely efficient weapons, or instruments born of cold calculation, designed not only to kill but to intimidate, to disable, to break a foe's resolve? In this story, we won't dwell on armor that saves. We will examine implements that ruin, blades tuned for deep, decisive thrusts, darts that lodged in shield or flesh, engines that spread fear from afar, and the unseen yet relentless systems that turned ordinary men into machines of conquest. This is where engineering meets tactics, an arsenal honed over centuries. Forget noble duels. We're heading into the mud, the fear, and the cold iron of battlefields from Britain to Parthia. Are you ready to learn why a short Roman sword could be more terrifying than a barbarian's long blade? How a single throwing spear could strip a unit of its defense? And which Roman weapon inspired the greatest fear, despite not being held in the hand? Stay with us to the end for 10 of the most punishing weapons and instruments in the Legionaries' world. This isn't only about arms, it's about the psychology of war, how calculation and ruthless efficiency became pillars of the Roman Empire. The gladius is the emblem of the Roman infantryman, compact to the eye, but perfected for decisive work at close quarters. Most blades measured around 50-60 centimeters, though designs shifted with time. The Mainz and Fulham types with broader profiles and long points early on, and the straighter-edged Pompey pattern later, all oriented around the thrust. In the biceps crusher formation, shoulder to shoulder behind the broad scutum shield, there is little room to swing wide. Here the gladius thrives. From behind the curve of his shield, a legionary snaps short, controlled thrusts, targeting the inevitable. Gaps that armor and motion create, lower abdomen, inside the thigh, armpit, base of the neck. The leaf-shaped blade with an acute tip was tuned for penetration and stability. It slipped between ribs or into soft targets, causing internal trauma and rapid loss of strength. In an age before advanced medicine, such wounds were often decisive. Ancient writers, Livy among them, remarked on the shock of foes who first met Roman sword work. The chilling economy of the thrust, the unnerving speed with which Roman troops repeated those motions, the steady drumbeat of men stepping forward and down. Its cruelty lay in its intimacy. The gladius killed at arm's length, close enough to see an opponent's eyes and hear his breath. To do this without faltering, the Roman trained relentlessly. He drilled with heavier practice swords against wooden posts, shield always forward, learning to thrust low, then high, to conserve motion, to keep his edge while the line pressed. There was no flourish, only results. One soldier, steady and practiced, could do terrible work in a few heartbeats. Yet the sword was only the finisher. Before it could complete the kill, Roman doctrine sought to strip the enemy's front line of protection, shake confidence, and rattle the ranks. For that, Rome had an answer as simple as it was brutal. If the gladius was the final argument, the pilum was the opening line. At first glance, it's a heavy javelin about 2 meters long. A wooden haft joined to a long, slender iron shank ending, in a hardened tip. Its construction reveals its purpose. The point bites. The softer iron shank bends on impact. Just before the lines met, legionaries hurled their pila from a range that kept force high, often 15 to 30 meters. Against a shield wall, the effect could be ruinous. A pilum that punched into a shield embedded deeply. Then, under its own weight and momentum, the shank bent. Now the defender faced a bad choice. Discard the shield, his main protection, since it had become a heavy, awkward lever, or keep it and fight with his stance compromised and vision blocked. Either option fractured cohesion. A unified wall became a ragged line of exposed men, and if the pilum struck flesh instead of wood, the long, narrow head bit deep, while the bent shank made removal difficult and dangerous on the field. The psychological effect was as important as the wounds. The thud of heavy javelins, the sudden fumbling at the front, the instant thinning of a once solid wall, these turned confidence into hesitation. Each legionary typically carried two pila, traditionally a heavier and a lighter, cast in sequence to maximize disruption. The pilum was more than a projectile. It was a shield breaker, a problem maker, a device that forced the enemy to choose between bad and worse, capturing the Roman genius for practical, ugly solutions to battlefield realities. Then came the push, and with it the most Roman weapon of all, the shield. The scutum was a large, curved rectangle of layered wood, faced with leather, rimmed in metal, anchored by an iron or bronze boss, the umbo. To many, a shield is merely protection. To a Roman, it was a weapon system. The scutum's size let a legionary hide most of his body as he advanced. Overlapped shield to shield, it formed the famous testudo, a moving shell that crawled forward under a rain of arrows and stones, but its ferocity showed at contact. The lower rim could smash into shins and knees, forcing an opponent to stumble or hop back and open his guard. The upper edge could ram under the chin or into the face. Most feared was the umbo, a driving punch, with that metal boss to the face, throat, or chest, could stun, bruise ribs, break teeth, and, most crucially, unbalance a foe for the fraction of a second a gladius thrust required. Roman training taught a rhythm both simple and devastating. Shove with the scutum, strike with the umbo, stab with the blade, reset, repeat. There was nothing ornate about it. It worked. Behind that wall of wood and iron, Roman soldiers moved, like a single creature. The front rank pressed, ranks behind braced. Men rotated in and out as needed. The line advanced. For a warrior with a long slashing sword, or a spear with no room to swing, this living wall, suddenly alive with rams and short, invisible thrusts, was a nightmare. The scutum broke not only wooden shafts and shields, but morale. To face it was to feel space compress, footing fail, and resolve thin, one push at a time. Roman martial thought, however, prized not only strength and drill, but cunning. They turned even empty ground into a weapon. Among their simplest, most merciless tools was the caltrop, tribulus to the Romans. Picture a small iron device with 4 spikes arranged so that however it lands, one point always faces upward. That simple geometry is a trap. Before cavalry approaches, in tall grass, on muddy ramps beneath walls, across likely routes of pursuit, Romans scattered these silent hazards by the bagful. Their cruelty lay in indiscriminate, lingering harm. For horsemen, a single step onto a caltrop could lame a mount instantly, bringing horse and rider down and turning a proud charge into a pileup. For infantry, especially those lightly shod or barefoot, a hidden spike meant a deep puncture, a sudden collapse, and in a world without antibiotics, a wound that could fester dangerously. Even when the iron did not pierce the thick sole of a caliga, it could lodge and wrench, hobbling a soldier at the worst moment. Caltrops shone in sieges and retreats. At the foot of walls they slowed and scattered attackers, forcing men to look down when they most needed to look ahead. During withdrawals, a quick sowing of tribuli bought precious minutes, turning pursuit into a hazardous crawl. Julius Caesar himself described fields seeded with hidden obstacles, pits, stakes, and iron barbs that punished rash advances. Caltrops were the unseen hand on the battlefield, a weapon that needed no wielder once placed, an economical way to make terrain an ally. Even after surviving the downpour of pila, the shield walls shove, and the traps underfoot, an attacker in the later empire might face one more surprise before steel met steel. The plumbata, literally lead-weighted, was a short dart tucked inside the shield, its wooden shaft fletched like an arrow and weighted with a lead bulb near the head. Vegetius, a late Roman author, praised these martio barbili, barbs, of Mars, for their impact in the seconds just before contact. The added weight meant a plumbata thrown in a shallow arc carried more force than its size suggested. In the tight space between closing ranks, These darts fell with disconcerting speed and accuracy. They could punch through leather and sometimes even into mail, biting deep. Legionaries carried several and cast them in a quick volley, just as the enemy committed to the final rush. The effect was to snatch away momentum. A few men flinched, a few shields angled at the wrong time. The straight line wavered. Those tiny beats are where disciplined troops thrive, and Rome excelled at creating them, then exploiting them. The plumbata was cheap to make, easy to carry, and perfectly matched to defensive tactics that lured an enemy in and punished his last step. On the Roman belt there was another blade alongside spear, sword, and dart, the pugio. At a glance, it was a backup, a broad double-edged dagger with a leaf-shaped blade, typically 15 to 30 centimeters long, in the crush of a grapple where a sword became awkward. A dagger had a different kind of authority. It could slip into gaps at the base of the neck, under the arm, or between armor plates. The pugio was also a daily companion for officers and men, used for camp tasks, slicing rations, cutting rope, and on grim occasions, enforcing order. Its most unsettling role appeared after the main clash. Fields after battle were full of wounded, some still able to strike, some able to recover, some likely to be rescued. Roman practicality, sometimes couched as mercy, demanded finality. The pugio provided it. Whether that act was merciful or merciless depends on one's vantage, but it belonged to the brutal arithmetic of ancient war. The dagger carried political weight too. Rome knew blades in the forum as well as on the frontier, and decorated pugiones were emblems of rank and status. In every case, the pugio reminds us that victory is not only the collision of lines, but the cold, close decisions made one-to-one, long after banners stop moving. If the gladius and pugio dealt in the intimacy of individual terror, Rome also wielded weapons of distant, impersonal annihilation. Its engineers gave the legions long arms. Chief among them stood the ballista. Imagine a giant torsion crossbow, arms anchored in frames of twisted sinew or rope storing energy, a winch to draw the string, a bed to guide a massive bolt or a round stone. The ballista was the mechanical marksman of antiquity. Smaller versions, scorpiones, could be aimed with surprising precision, even at individual soldiers. Carroballistae were mounted on carts, marching with the army and providing mobile fire. Larger engines flung iron-tipped bolts with enough force to punch through shields, armor, and sometimes several bodies in a row. They made standing on a wall during a siege an exercise in courage and calculation. A whistling bolt that arrives, unseen and unstoppable, chills morale in ways no duel can. Ballistae were tactical and psychological instruments. A battery firing in sequence could keep defenders' heads down, interrupt repairs, and shield sappers under a canopy of threat. Caesar relied on them in Gaul, famously at Alesia, where Roman engineering and missile engines applied pressure at every distance. Ancient sources praise the accuracy of these machines. While some accounts may color the truth, the reality is clear. Rome applied drill, mathematics, and method to its engines just as it did to its men. Crews learned to gauge range and wind, to adjust elevation, to change chord twist for consistent power. To the besieged, the ballista announced a new kind of war. Geometry and rhythm, clean lines, careful angles, the regular thud and snap of arms loosed in sequence, and the knowledge that a machine that did not tire, did not fear, and did not hesitate had you in its sights. If the ballista was the empire's sniper, the onager was its howitzer. Its very name, Wild Donkey, came from the violent kick of its arm when released. Where the ballista shot straight, the onager lobbed. A stout wooden frame anchored a single lever arm, twisted up with ropes or sinew. At the tip sat a sling or cup. Winch the arm down, load the projectile. Stone sphere, jar filled with incendiaries. Release. The arm whipped up, smashed into a stop beam, and the shot arced high, descending with punishing force onto walls, roofs, and packed ranks. Onagers hurled stones weighing tens of kilograms across hundreds of meters. They were not precision instruments. They were sledgehammers, aimed at masonry and morale alike. Under onager fire, a siege became a strain on mind and body. Stones crashed through rooftops, turning rooms into traps. Towers shuddered, parapets splintered. Fires bloomed where clay, pots filled with pitch, oil, and resin shattered. Roman crews did not shy from darker payloads either. The bodies of the dead, human or animal, hurled to spread fear and disease. Grisly messages to convince defenders that resistance invited ruin. The thump of release, the whip of the rising, sling, the growing whisper of a falling projectile. These sounds taught sleeplessness. They wore down resolve. When defenders could not rest, when their city seemed to crumble from the sky itself, negotiation began to sound less like surrender and more like relief. Onagers did not win battles alone, but they changed the tempo of a siege. They told defenders that time and physics were not on their side. By the late Empire, even the shape of Roman swordplay changed. The classic pairing of scutum and gladius, so suited to tight, disciplined fighting, gave way to something looser, more fluid. Enter the spatha. Longer than the gladius, often 70 to 90 centimeters, the spatha began as a cavalry blade, its reach ideal for cutting from the saddle. As Rome's enemies evolved and frontier warfare demanded flexibility, infantry took it up too. A longer sword encourages different habits. Instead of a shield pressed to the chest and short thrusts from behind it, the spatha invites slashes, diagonal cuts, and a broader stance. It can still thrust, but its weight and reach favor decisive cuts. With the spatha came a more visible brutality, where the gladius left compact punctures, no less lethal for their modest size. The spatha carved longer, more obvious gashes, and struck with momentum enough to crack helmets and destroy guard positions. Fighting with it was bloodier to behold, and more chaotic, involving more movement, more individual exchanges, and looser order rather than a single living wall. Tactics shifted too. Units sometimes fought in wider intervals, cavalry played a larger role, and soldiers needed agility to adapt to swirling fights rather than the old squeeze of shield against shield. The spatha symbolized an age of constant pressure at the borders, raids and counter-raids, flexible foes, and Rome's transformation. It remained efficient, still Roman, but bore a rougher edge suited to rougher times. Yet if you ask what Rome's most fearsome weapon truly was, the answer is not a blade or a machine. It is something more fundamental, more pervasive: discipline and engineering. These twin forces shaped every other tool and tactic. Discipline made Romans hold firm while missiles fell, advance behind their shields when instincts screamed to scatter, complete complex maneuvers that required trust in the men to left and right. It was built by relentless drill, by clear rewards for bravery and loyalty, and by punishments as stark as anything on the field. For grave offenses, cowardice, dereliction, the loss of a standard, death could follow. The most infamous penalty was decimation. In a disgraced unit, lots were drawn, and every 10th man was executed by his comrades. Imagine that ritual, the drawing of stones, the counting, the final silence after blows. Rare, yes, but the knowledge of it lived in every soldier's mind. Lesser punishments, cudgeling for serious breaches, fines, reduction of rations, loss of privileges, enforced order day to day. Out of this harsh regimen came something remarkable. Units that could trust each other to hold formation under agony. Men who could be relied upon not to run when running would doom the line. Engineering translated discipline into dominance. A Roman army did not merely march, it remade the ground. At day's end, it dug a fortified camp, ditches, ramparts, gates, so regularly that from Britain to Syria, the earth still remembers their outlines. When a river blocked the path, Roman builders threw bridges across in days. When forests stood in the way, they cut roads. When a city needed to be taken, they measured, leveled, and raised siege works. Towers that crept forward under cover. Rams that pounded gates. covered galleries that brought sappers to a wall's base, embankments that elevated attackers over defenders. Their logistics were engineering feats too, standardized loads, modular tools, supply lines traced across the landscape, like veins. To face a Roman army was to face a creature that brought its own fortress with it, that was prepared for a long choke rather than a quick brawl, that could turn patience into a weapon sharper than any sword. Caesar's campaigns make the pattern: plain, bridges thrown over broad rivers to shock enemies into submission, circumvallation lines that enclosed not only cities, but the relieving forces beyond them, siege rings that starved resolve as surely as they starved men. Even in the open, engineering mattered. Field entrenchments shaping the battle, temporary works anchoring flanks, obstacles funneled foes into killing grounds. Discipline made the army one body. Engineering gave that body reach and staying power. Together, these two, iron discipline and unrivaled engineering, were Rome's most brutal weapons. They enabled a form of total warfare aimed not just at winning a clash, but at breaking a people's will to resist. Let the enemy see the regularity of your camps, the clean sweep of roads where none existed yesterday, the bridges over rivers that once promised safety. Let him hear the steady clack of ballistae and the periodic thunder of onagers. Let his scouts report that the legions do the same things, the same way, every day, no matter how far they have marched or how hot the fight. Let him understand that you will not tire before he does. That is a weapon, terrible because it is, always present, impossible to disarm, persuasive not only to bodies but to minds. And so, the legionaries' arsenal was never just a heap of tools. It was a philosophy of war forged in wood, iron, and stone. Every implement, from the short gladius to the giant onager, was the result of cool, pragmatic thinking aimed at maximum effect. Their cruelty lay in efficiency, not spectacle. The gladius, the pilum, the scutum, the caltrop, the plumbata, the pugio, the ballista, the onager, the spatha. Each was a link in a chain that bound tactics to engineering and discipline to victory. But as we have seen, the most fearsome weapon was the system itself. Unyielding discipline, practiced engineering, and the ability to turn thousands of individuals into one relentless mechanism that rolled over everything in its path. By studying these weapons and the system that wielded them, we see not only how the Romans fought, but how they thought: orderly, pragmatic, relentless toward enemies, confident in their right to shape the world around them. It was a harsh age, and its instruments were made to match it. If this journey into the hard world of Roman warfare gripped you, and you want to explore more about how soldiers of the past trained, fought, lived and died, support the work, like and subscribe. Many more stories await about the fiercest armies and the deadliest technologies in human history.